Sassoon.
Wait a second.
Oh, now the recording started. Okay. Hi, my name is Richard Sassoon, and for those of you who are wondering why there's laughter in the background, this is because we've been trying to record several times in a row. This is redefining the Macedonian identity, and the Macedonian identity is something that developed over time and has numerous influences, both from people inside of what we're going to call, what I'm going to call Vardar, which is today the Republic of North Macedonia, right? It was called Vardar Macedonia for a very long period of time, and that term is apolitical, generally speaking. So I'm going to call it that for the duration of this. So there are people within Vardar who have been trying to develop this identity. There are people outside of Vardar who have been trying to control or somehow define the terms of that identity. And there are some people who are rejecting any sort of identity that's specifically focused on Vardar, right? Both inside the region and outside of the region. So we're going to track through history how that developed. And I tend to take more sort of a narrow linear approach. So that's the approach that I'm going to do. And Aaron is really great in that he can see thematic developments over decades and centuries in different places. And that's the contribution that he's really going to bring to the table. So Macedonia as a concept really comes out of the ancient period. And you see on the left-hand side, you can see that there are a number of different Greek city-states, and each of these Greek city-states has a dialect of Greek that exists somewhere along a continuum of the various ancient Greek language dialects. Now, Macedonian as a language sits outside, generally speaking, of some of these dialects. It's very close, but not necessarily directly related. If you look at the Chalcidice, or as the Greeks called the Chalkidiki, it looks sort of like the three pointing down. That's the area close to where Thessaloniki today is, and that region was Greek speaking. You can see that their dialect is actually very similar to the dialect Nieboia, and distantly related, but still within the same family as that spoken in Athens, right? So the Greek language that was spoken in the southern part of Macedonia, in what's called Aegean Macedonia, to the extent that it was Greek, was very similar to the Greek that we find in Lower Greece. In the parts to the north, it may have been a little bit different. And we also see that there's a few differences in Macedonian culture than there was versus the Greek city-state culture. One of the easiest to identify differences is that they had a very much different relationship with the Persian Empire than the Greek city-states ever did. They fell under Persian occupation several times. And you can see this is in the center, this is actually from Persepolis in Iran. In Persepolis, they have a monument to what they call the 20 nations. These are the various sub-countries that were part of the Persian Empire. In the Persian conception, as we've talked about on other lectures, the Persians saw themselves as the king of kings, right? Which meant that there were kings below them, right? Other nations that were subordinate to Persia, and Persia was simply the master of the world, right? So you had this particular representative, and this is a representative of Macedonia, of the Macedonian people. And you can see the hat that he's wearing, which is typical of Macedonian soldiers at the time. You can, this relationship with Persia, with this idea of kingship and kingdom, was one of the fundamental distinctions between ancient Macedonia and the Greek city-states further to the south, even if they were linguistically united and culturally united to a certain degree. And we see this in the fact that Macedonians almost always had an absolute ruler monarch, which we almost never see in the Greek city-states. We have some kings who have a significant amount of power, but even in those cases, it's curtailed by some sort of group of counselors. Of course, in Athens, you have the extreme opposite, where you have what is effectively a landed gentry plebiscite, a landed gentry democracy. You will have somebody appointed who has certain dictatorial powers, but the idea of a hereditary long-term monarch was something that distinguished Macedonian civilization from the rest of the Greek world. And you can see, of course, that statue of Alexander. This statue of Alexander, by the way, is from Skopje, the capital of North Macedonia, and represents this idea of kingship. Additionally, though, we should point out from the Greek side that Greek culture was part and parcel of what was taught and studied and lived in Macedonia They followed the same gods. Aristotle, of course, born in Athens, was Alexander the Great's teacher. There was certainly a cultural confluence between the lower Greek city-states and
Yeah. Excuse me, Rich. I think Aristotle was born in Stagira in Chalcidice.
Okay,
He just moved there as a maybe at the age of 18 or something like that to Athens.
okay. Thank you for the clarification. So,
Richard,
yeah.
one quick question. So how do the Greeks look at the Macedonians? Like less civilized, or how did the Macedonians, do we know? How do they look?
The Greek position towards the Macedonians was as a threat. They saw the Macedonians as being similar to Greeks, but because they controlled a larger area of territory and they were not a city-state, right? That they were a small empire, and they were ruled by this direct monarch. They were seen as a potential long-term adversary, because the Greek city-states individually could not fight Macedon. If they came together, then they could. But that sort of imbalance of power meant that Macedonia was something that was Greek-ish, but not a Greek ally. Think the same way that the Greeks saw the Trojans.
Okay.
Because the Trojans were also speaking Greek. You can see on this map that the area controlled by the Trojans was actually speaking another similar Ionic species of Greek. But
Richard,
yeah.
I don't think that's correct. At the time of the Trojan War, at least, they weren't Greek. The major occupation of Ionia happened later. I mean, there was some earlier. It happened like in 11th century, maybe around 1000. Trojans were Phrygians. They didn't speak Greek. Maybe
the Trojans in the Trojan War, yes. But I'm talking about, if we're talking about people who were living in Troy in the classical period, they weren't part.
Okay.
They were part of the Persian Empire, but they were Greek speaking. They were speaking.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. At the time of Persian Empire, of course.
Yeah.
Well, not to cause a controversy, but how did Greeks view, Macedonians, Dorian Greeks? What do they think of them?
I don't know specifically.
It's very hard to hear you, Zach.
No, I mean, Zach basically asked the same question you did, but specifying the Dorians. I don't know specifically how the Dorians saw them. I think more or less they were outside of their purview, right? Because Dorians are toward the south and Dorians are toward the north.
Could I say a few words about that? From what I know from my readings, up until Philip II, Macedonians, Greeks actually kind of despised Macedonians. They were nothing. They could never stand up to even small contingent of hoplites. Their army were not organized as Greeks. I mean, they did speak Greek dialects, so they were kind of Greeks, but some Greeks saw them as Greeks on Hellenic tribes, or maybe some Greeks thought of them as barbarians. It only started to really rise into something significant at the time of Philip, because prior to Philip, Macedonia really didn't present for Greece any significant threat or any significant force. At the time of father of Philip, Amyntas III, they were afraid of Athenians or anybody else. Any kind of engagement they were losing all the time. And as a result, actually Greeks had to intervene into the civil war after the death of father Amyntas III, and they actually established the king there, his brother Alexander I, and then Perdiccas III. So that's how it looks. Later on, of course, when Philip came to power, and after the Battle of Chaeronea in 338, I believe, that at the end of this Sacred Wars, of course, at this point, it was he united the Greeks. This became Hellenic state, so that the Greeks looked completely different now, and Macedonians were overlords. Sorry,
Right.
I mean, that's all.
No, I know. I think that's a perfect lead in to sort of the next stage of this, right? Is that once Alexander the Great had gone, he had basically created a Macedonian Hellenistic culture that spanned this vast region, right? All these, I decided to shade it this way because then you can see all the successor states. The ones west of Greece, I don't know, because it's a Roman Greek map. But if you look at the areas in the Balkans, in Asia Minor, in the Middle East, you can see that this Hellenistic culture that was supported by the Macedonians through the conquest of Alexander the Great and his subsequent generals created sort of a unifying Greek language speaking population in almost all of these areas, right? We begin to lose Greek speaking in the Middle East from a number of factors, such as the Persianization under the Sassanids, the changes under the Arabs in the Levant or in Mesopotamia or in Egypt. But for a long period of time, you had a number of people whose dominant language was Greek, even if they were not ancestrally the populations of Attica, Boeotia, the Peloponnesos, areas where Greek had been spoken originally, and including north of the Chalkidiki, that southern area of South Macedonia. That follows into the Roman period, right? So even, and the Roman period sort of expands in terms of its area in the Balkans, the area that Greek is spoken. And even though it was the Roman Empire, by the time that it had divided into the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire, Greek was the dominant language of that empire. So like, for example, we can look at the empire of Justinian I. This was his empire at its maximum extent. And you can see on the lower right-hand side, this is a letter. It's written in Greek. It's between two normal individuals, but it's coming out of Egypt. So you can see sort of the presence of Greek as a language existing far beyond the confines of people who simply would have identified as ethnic Greeks. And at the same time, right, because Justinian was also the head of the Orthodox Church, the liturgy and organization of Orthodoxy, especially as it was promulgated throughout the Balkans, was a Greek Orthodoxy. So the liturgy was in Greek, the sermons were in Greek, all the icons were labeled in Greek. There was a very strong sense of Greekness to the religion, regardless of whether the indigenous people were themselves Greek or not. Then we sort of move into a Byzantine collapse, right? And there's a reason, you know, at the end of the 500s, beginning of the 600s, that this happens. It's primarily the plague of Justinian, right? So the plague of Justinian really hollows out, and you can see the painting concerning the plague on the right-hand side. It really hollows out that area of the Balkans. If we go back, we can see that the area that's now modern Bulgaria, the area that's part of Yugoslavia, Albania, these were all parts of the Byzantine Empire, and these areas were all hit quite severely by the plague. So with that decrease in population making it much harder for the Romans to hold the Danube position, you begin to see Slavic migrations from what's now Ukraine and Western Russia through Romania and into the Balkan area. This is especially led by the Avars, and their Khaganate had a large contingent of Slavic forces in it. The Avars actually repeatedly besieged Constantinople, and even though they weren't able to take that city, it made clear that the Byzantines couldn't hold the frontier, and so they began to settle both in lands that the Byzantines claimed, like Bulgaria, which they called Moesia, and Yugoslavia, but also to the north of those areas, right, which is why you have Slavic presence throughout Southeastern Europe. So,
what about Bulgars? Weren't they also sometimes about 7th century? I don't know.
yeah, exactly. The Slavic invasions came in several waves. This is, of course, the first wave. The Bulgar invasion was the second wave,
Okay.
about 100, 200 years later. So you have these successive Slavic invasions coming into the area. And at first, they're nomadic, pillaging, conquering, that sort of thing. But eventually they start settling and they start making homes. And because of the depopulation that occurred because of the plague of Justinian, there was a lot of space for them to be able to become the dominant population of the region.
And the slaves were from where originally? From around Kiev or?
We don't know how far east the Slavs originally were. They didn't leave a lot of written records. There are some people who guess that they came as far east as what's now Kazakhstan. Some people say that they come from the area of Russia that is between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And some people say they start as far west as we see here, which is central Ukraine into Western Russia. So it could be any of those locations. The Slavs really didn't start writing down their language until they moved into what we call Europe, and other people around them only started noticing them when they started actually conquering or attacking them. The best evidence we have that Slavs started a little bit further east of this map is the Hungarian language, because the Hungarians, we know, started somewhere in the Urals, and as they moved further west, they added loan words based on the peoples that they bumped into. And a number of the Slavic loan words that they added trace themselves back to when the Hungarians were a little bit east of this position in terms of their migration. So it could be that they're from the area like near Rostov-on-Don, which would be, if you see on the map, you can see Crimea. To the northeast of Crimea is the Sea of Azov. That area would be where the Hungarians interacted with them. Probably. So, but then again, this is just simply through linguistic analysis and guessing based on the speed of the Hungarian movement. So again, it's a very sort of haphazard way of trying to figure out where they were. Okay. The archaeology, as you can see here, traces them back only to that area that's in the dark pink in 300 CE. But just because they didn't leave archaeological remains didn't mean that as a nomadic people, they didn't go somewhere else or come from somewhere else. All right. So, sorry, is there a question?
No, I sneezed, sorry.
Okay, no worries. Okay, so then you have this Greek-speaking population with new Slavic populations intermixed, but those Slavic populations are still, when they became Christian in the Orthodox way. So they were going to these Greek cathedrals where the services were run in Greek. Now, you began, and for example, this is a Serbian Orthodox holy site in Peć. It's now in Kosovo. And that was where the Serbian Orthodox Church really started, was in Kosovo. But for example, this kind of church would have had its services done in Greek with Greek iconography. The Slavic languages only began to be written down when, for example, Saint Cyril and other Greek Orthodox leaders, bishops and similar, began to try and find a way to write the Bible in Slavic languages. But even then, the service was always still in Greek, and the relationship was under the Greek Patriarchate. And this is exactly what the Ottoman Empire recognized. So you can see the Ottoman Empire under the reign of Mehmed II in 1481. He had taken Constantinople in 1453, so that was the locus of his empire. And you see that he controls all the area that is now today the country of Bulgaria, about half of what's today Yugoslavia, Greece, and some of the other countries in the region. Under this system, did I put a map? No, I didn't put a map. Under this system, the Ottomans decided to organize the religious minorities into what were called millets. And each millet or nation, because millet comes from milia in Arabic, meaning country or nation, each millet would be represented by the ecclesiastical order of that religion. So there was for example, the millet of the Jews, there was the millet of the Armenians, and there was the millet, what they called, of Rome, or Rum. And the millet of Rome was the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. So all of these Orthodox individuals from Bulgaria, from Greece, from southern Yugoslavia, all these places were organized under the millet of Rome because they were all represented by these Greek patriarchs, right? Regardless of whether their personal language at home was Greek or not, they were, in the eyes of Ottoman law and in the eyes of religious construction, Greek.
So the service was in Greek, but everybody spoke different languages.
Absolutely. Right? Like, for example, Albanians who were, there were Albanians who were members of Rome, right? And they were speaking their Albanian languages.
Can I just add a side note? Of course, we know at this time that's when Inquisition happened, and I think that the Sultan sent ships to pick up Sephardic Jews. So a lot of the Bulgarian and Macedonian Jews are actually Sephardic Jews, which is interesting, as Sephardim obviously stands for Spain. So that you were just mentioning Millet. So it's
right. No, but the thing is that when the Sephardic Jews came to the Ottoman Empire, they were part of the Jewish millet, right? That was the organization. So the millets didn't have territorial jurisdiction; they had religious jurisdiction. So you could have, a Greek Orthodox community right next to a Jewish community, right next to an Armenian community, and all those different communities, even if they were in the same city, would be administered in terms of their tax recovery, in terms of their civil rights to the degree that they had them. Those would be administered by their distinct millets.
right.
What about the Serbian Orthodox Church?
This is one of the developments I'm going to talk about. But the Serbian Orthodox Church was not considered autocephalous at this point. It was part of the Greek Orthodox Church under the Ottomans. They saw that as part of the millet of Rome.
And they still had services conducted in Greek, not Slavic?
At this time, there were readings of the Bible in Old Church Slavonic, but the actual liturgy would be the same as the one coming out of Constantinople. In fact, you can see here in the lower left-hand side, this is the in Constantinople. There was a region called Phanar, and the Greeks who lived here were called Phanariotes. The Phanariotes were the ones who were in charge of organizing all of the services of the Greek millet, of the millet of Rome, throughout the entire empire. And in fact, there was a lot of antagonism between the Phanariotes and the Greeks elsewhere in the empire, because remember, they're in Constantinople. The majority of the millet of Rome exists throughout the Balkans. We're talking about in Bulgaria and proper Greece and southern Yugoslavia and all of these areas. Though that's where the majority of the millet of Rome is. And yet here are the people who just happen to be in Constantinople, relatively wealthy and affluent, and connected to the Sublime Porte, the Ottoman government.
Richard, and this was very unusual to have a place that there is a freedom of religion like that, like everybody.
Freedom of religion is a very strong term.
Yeah,
I would say they
kind
had permission to practice the religion freely, but not without consequence. So there
was no other place that there was like that.
Correct. I would agree with you that the ability to be something other than the dominant religion easily without the fear of direct persecution was something that was unique in the Ottoman system.
And it really became foundational to their, you think of it almost as their tributary or vassalization model, which gives them a lot of like agility. Like think of them almost like a corporation, right? It's like you could try to impose from headquarters all these like incredible, rules, compliance, models, like you have to do it this way, or you just allow these units to sort of dynamically hit their targets, tax collection, basically low conflict, adherence to the ring, right? Like basically kiss the mafia ring, so you have these half a dozen maybe priorities. And as long as you hit those and you don't have anyone in your millet that's sort of, you know, trying to stand up a little guerrilla movement or anything, you're pretty much good to go. I mean, it was actually, you could argue this was, and we don't see it this way. This is one of the reasons Richard and I really wanted to do this. We just sort of pass through this era and sort of say Ottomans, funny outfits, you know, old man of the sea, it all falls apart and that's it, right? And we don't sort of, I believe, treat them with this sort of emergent evolutionary political respect that they constructed, you know, arguably one of the most complex confederations in history, really, for, you know, almost half a millennia, and think that they were doing this while, and this is part of what we're talking about now, is that we always only view basically Western Christianity as this evolutionary Christianity, right? Where you all these hundreds of sects, hundreds, you know, thousands of movements kind of spawn off all over the world. But in the East, there's an ethno-national orthodoxies that basically get developed. And that's sort of where, and I'll pass it back to you, Richard, but that's sort of really what we're arguing is this sort of fusion of the ethno-national orthodoxies, which allow you to have legitimacy with your own people, right? So that's how you can build this sort of machine of identity, right? And you see versions of that in Latin America, obviously, maybe not to these extremes, but you know, you have that, you have versions of that, and that's sort of these freedom's a strong word. These almost liberty movements is almost what it is, right? If that makes sense. So, anyways, I'll pass it back to you, Richard.
Yeah. No, and Aaron is completely right in that. This sort of millet model more or less prevented a lot of these groups from trying to declare independence. There were rebellions from time to time, but nothing like you would expect from the fact that the Ottomans were governing an area where they were a slight majority. The Muslims in the Balkans, by about the 1800s or 1700s, 1800s, were probably about 55% of the population if you go province by province. There were some provinces, like for example, Bihać, which is in the western part of what's now Bosnia, which was like 85-90% Muslim, and it still is very high Muslim today. But
Richard,
yeah,
may I ask a question?
Sure.
So among this group that have their own millet, if they have problem, let's say across the group, somebody murder someone across the group, what type of law do they use? They use Ottoman law?
Sorry, just to confirm. When you say across the group, you're saying somebody from Rome kills somebody from Rome, or somebody from, or are you saying somebody from Rome kills somebody from Jewish, or are you saying somebody from Rome kills somebody from the dominant Muslim religion?
Yes, either way. So let's say somebody kills somebody across to Muslim and somebody, the Rome kills somebody from Jew. What type of laws do they use? Thank you.
Sure. If somebody within the millet kills, if somebody within the millet transgresses somebody within the millet, it is resolved by the leadership of the millet. So the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, if somebody from Rome kills somebody from Rome, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch will apply the Greek law on murder. If it is an offense that the Sultan takes particular interest in, he may choose to remove it to the Ottoman courts and have it decided according to the law that he supposes. But this is very rare. It doesn't happen that often. If it is a case between two individuals of different millets, then it goes to the courts of the Sultanate. It is if it is Ottoman law is a very complex vehicle. If there are certain sets of laws that are decreed by the Sultan and certain sets of laws that are decreed by who's called the Sheikh al-Islam, who is the head of Islamic governance. And so, for example, laws of inheritance are the purview of the Sheikh al-Islam, while as laws on commerce and trade belong to the Sultan. So depending on which particular grievance it is, it would go to the courts of one of those and the proper law would be applied. So it could be the case that the Jew and the Christian would be adjudicated according to Islamic law because it's the court of the Sheikh al-Islam, so it would be Islamic law. If it's the case that, but the evidentiary standard for both of them is the same. If it's against, one party is a Muslim and one party is a millet party, then it will go to the court of the Sultan or to the Sheikh al-Islam, depending, of course, again, on this legalistic divide. But the choice of who would be, but the evidentiary standards are different. The evidentiary standards are biased during the Ottoman period in favor of Muslims. This was actually a consistent complaint of the Armenian millet, was that whenever they got into trade disputes with Muslims, that the Muslims' evidence was considered more valuable despite it being the same quality of evidence as the Armenian evidence.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, okay. So the part that I wanted to sort of highlight about what Aaron was saying was that this sort of millet system really staved off a lot of rebellion and conflict in areas where Ottoman Muslims were they were a majority, but they were not a significant majority, right? If the Ottomans wanted to rule, they could either rule through military dictatorial fiat and forcible repression. They could have taken that tactic, but then they would have had no economy, right? Because it would have just been paying all the soldiers to keep maintaining the areas. And in some parts, like what's now southern Bulgaria, which was called Rumelia, there was a huge military presence anyway, which could have been spread throughout the entire region. But they didn't have to do that because the millet system, by and large, satisfied the needs of identity that most people had during the medieval period, which was a religious center of identity. But once you start moving into the 1800s, we see romance, uppercase R romance, right? Coming from Europe, this idea that it's not just religion that is the center of your identity. It's about your language, it's about your culture, it's about your food, it's about your history. And you begin to see these identities becoming much more organized in sort of a mental component, if we can say, than they had been during the previous centuries. And one of the first mentalities to come at the end of this was the Greek ethnic identity, which had basically remained dormant throughout most of the Ottoman period up to this point, right? So you had the Greeks, and in the beginning, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, they began to petition for independence. And starting in 1821, they fought the Greek War of Independence, which by 1826 would liberate the Peloponnesos, Attica, and Boeotia from Ottoman control. What's important to focus on with this War of Independence are several different markers. The first one is the one that you see in the upper left-hand picture. You can see that the Greek soldier is bending the Greek flag for it to be blessed by bishops within the Orthodox Church. So you can begin to see that there's a fusion between the religious identity of Rome and the nationalistic identity of Greek, right? This was something that had not occurred during the time that Rome was a millet, right? The patriarchs of Rome did not associate with any particular movement towards an independent Greek state, but now they were. And there was a holy war aspect to the Greek Revolution and the Greek independence. This is a Christian attempt by the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate to liberate itself from the Ottoman Empire. You also saw a break here between the Greek bishops who were in the Peloponnesos, in Attica, in Boeotia, in the areas of what we would consider today southern Greece, and the Fanariotes, right? The Fanariotes are living in Constantinople. They are the ones who are running the Rum system, and they're in favor of the perpetuation of the Rum system because it brings to them wealth, prosperity, and security. So we begin to see that this system that had held together for a while is beginning to break down. Another point that we need to take from this is that there were people outside of the Fanariotes and outside of the people in southern Greece who were part of the Greek Orthodox world, who were part of the Rum world, who didn't identify with either party. They were having their own nationalistic experience, right? These are the Slavic peoples, right? They're having their own nationalistic experience. We as Slavs speak our own Slavic language. We have our own food. We have our own way of communicating. And yet we're not encapsulated by the will of the Fanariotes, and we're not encapsulated by the will of the Southern Greeks, because we're not Greek. This is not our language, history, and culture. And so you have, for example, St. Paisios of Hilandar, who's in the upper right-hand side, and he argues for a break between the Greek Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox churches that exist in what's now Bulgaria. And so he declares, eventually, with a number of other Greek Orthodox bishops, the exarchate, meaning that they broke away from the patriarchate, right? They exarch themselves, they cut themselves off, the exarchate of Bulgaria. And you can see on the map on the lower right-hand side, all of the orange-red territories are those that were claimed by priests who were previously part of the Millet of Rum, who declared themselves to be part of the exarchate of Bulgaria. The ones that are in green still remained loyal to the Fanariotes. Now, because the exarchate of Bulgaria declared independence as a millet, the Ottoman Empire decided to recognize it as a distinct millet. So you began to have the exarchate of Bulgaria becoming its own millet. And in fact, between 1850 and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there was a recognition of an additional 9 different millets because of all of the different religious splintering that was going on throughout the empire. And so the Ottoman Empire was trying to preserve this millet system to incorporate the nationalistic impulse that was now gripping these religious communities. It wasn't enough to sustain the system, but it shows that from the Ottoman perspective, the goal was to preserve the empire in whatever way the people were beginning to change it.
Richard, and all these groups that were kind of agricultural, do they have trade? Did they trade with their own people? Did they trade, were part of any trading path or something, or they are
generally speaking, these are relatively backwards areas. They have some trade, there's some agriculture, but more or less we're like, when you think of peasants, backroad Europe, that's what you're finding here. You have some of the cities like Thessaloniki, for example, which was a huge trade hub. But by and large, once you get outside of Thessaloniki or Athens or Sofia or Plovdiv, you're not seeing major cities. And the cities of what are Macedonia today, like Ohrid, Skopje, those cities are very, very small at this time.
And there is no mixture of people, it's kind of more.
Oh no, there's an absolute mixture of people. There's people all over the place. These areas are extremely diverse.
Yeah.
When I say, for example, if you look at that map and I say that that's the territory that belongs to the Bulgarian Exarchate, what I mean by that is that if you have a church that identified with the Millet of Rome, that church is now identifying with the Exarchate of Bulgaria. That's not to say that there weren't Jews and Muslims and Catholics and other minorities in those areas that simply were not identified with Rome before, and therefore were not switching to the Exarchate of Bulgaria.
Richard, what about the contemporary border between North Macedonia and Greek Macedonia, right? I mean, those two regions, I mean, they were kind of like separated from an ancient times, right? To some point. But at the time of, in Roman times, they had two different provinces.
In Roman times, there were two different provinces. During the Byzantine period, they really didn't. It was one province.
Do you think that the Slavic penetration to the Greek Macedonia was less because it was part of Byzantine Empire?
I disagree. I think Slavic penetration into what's now southern Macedonia was quite high during this period. You can see that actually quite strongly from the Exarchate map that I just provided to you. Almost all of.
By the way, that was a question, not a statement.
Yeah. No, we're going to address why that's not the case today. But at this period in time, absolutely, there was either a Slavic majority or over 40% Slavic minority in what's now southern Macedonia.
I know that Saloniki was a predominantly Jewish town
Right. Well, Thessaloniki was majority Jewish in the 16th, 17th, and beginning of the 18th centuries.
Right.
But by the 19th century, it was no longer majority Jewish. All right. So now we start to move into the late 1800s, and you begin to see assertions of independence. Probably the first one that we're going to see is called the Gemijite, often called the Assassins of Salonika. And in 1898, you have this revolt led by people who spoke a language similar to Bulgarian. We have to remember at this time, and for all future discussions, that Bulgarian, like any language at this time, was not formalized and standardized. And to the degree that it was standardized based on its Eastern dialects. But all the languages from the Albanian border to the Black Sea are in this sort of belt of Bulgarian languages. Think about it the same way that, for example, in Spain, we have Catalan and then Aragonese and then Castilian and then Asturian and then Gallego, Galician. And all these languages are sort of in a belt of Hispanic languages that are sort of related to each other. You have this belt of Bulgarian languages. So these are Bulgaric speakers. It's probably from the western part of that span. And they rose up in Thessaloniki to try and declare it as Solon, the capital of a Bulgaric Macedonian state.
So what did they want? What was
Independence from the Ottomans.
But the independence was Thessaloniki or all the area or what?
Well,
they
started in Thessaloniki. I think their goal was to create independence for all of Macedonia. They were thwarted by the Ottoman officials and tortured and executed for this. The point that is important to make here, though, is that this is an event where the Bulgarians today see these Gemijite as being Bulgarian and fighting for the independence, the future, and the future survival of what would become Bulgaria, right? And the expansion of Bulgaria into areas where Slavs were, at least in the Bulgarian perception, a majority. And from the Macedonian perspective, this is the first instance of Macedonian pushes for independence to create a state of Macedon. So we're going to see that in many cases, there will be joint national heroes, but with differing perceptions, especially between Bulgarians and Macedonians, because the language of Macedonia is on that belt of Bulgarian dialects, right? It's the same way that, for example, people might say that Portuguese is on the belt of Spanish dialects, right? The fact that Portugal has been independent for 600 years lends people to think that Portuguese is somehow distinct or somehow outside of this Spanish belt, but that's only because of time, right? That, like, you could easily say that there's enough commonality between Portuguese and Galician and Asturian that it's in that belt. It's not plopped down from Mars.
And the other thing that's important to recognize is that the combination of the topography, which is this is an extremely mountainous area, means that it's sort of perfectly configured for small regional ethno-nationalist or ethno-religious dialect-driven populations, because it's just so difficult, even to this day, to try to enforce anything from a central authority. And the other piece of it is this sort of continuous desire for, whether it's a pan of Bulgarianism or continuous other pan movements, whether, obviously the pan-Serbianism, we've seen that the last 30 to 50 years. There's always been these sort of movements sort of stacked on each other, and they sort of, as Richard said, they sort of opportunistically grab features of prior movements, either because they fit a narrative or a mythology, or they're just convenient and effective. And so there's just this continuous desire. It's almost like to me the best analogy is, imagine that the Spanish could never have sustained central authority in the last 200 years in Spain. I mean, there would be at least 5 probably, and maybe another 5 attempted movements to basically, fracture what we would call Spain, and we would, we would define Spain almost in a Yugoslavian way.
I think there's actually a better example. If you look at Simón Bolívar, for example, in Latin America,
absolutely.
and he created the Gran Colombia, right? All of his generals somehow become they become whatever ethnicity their descendant is, right? They are Venezuelan generals in Venezuela, and they're Colombian generals in Colombia, and they're Ecuadorian generals in Ecuador. They don't take the nationality of the place where they were born, or if you had asked them on an interview, like, do you identify as Venezuelan? He would have been like, what's a Venezuela? I'm from Gran Colombia, right? Like, but these post-states have integrated this past mythology of people who were presumably working to all of these different ends and whose final goal wasn't realized in their lifetime to have this a posteriori goal.
That's a fantastic analogy. That's absolutely even better. And the difference is that, at least within the broader Pan-American movements, there became sort of a fixed state mostly. Whereas in this region, the fixedness is very, very recent, actually. And I mean, arguably, it probably will stay fixed given the modern, the influences of the EU and the economy and how little people care about some of these movements. But that's a very recent phenomenon. People really define their identity for quite a long time based on these sort of movements.
So the next sort of movement we see is the Khrushchev Republic. So the Khrushchev Republic exists for a whole 10 days, and it's in the city of Khrushchevo. What's important here, these are Komitaji. Komitaji are somewhere along that Bulgarian axis of dialects, right? So Macedonians claim them as Macedonian, Bulgarians claim them as Bulgarian. And this is the first successful independence movement by what would be people in Vardar, right? People in the northern part of Macedonia. And since it only existed for 10 days, we can't really say much about its economy, its growth potential, or anything similar, but it did create a sense of possibility that Vardar could be somehow governing outside of an Ottoman worldview.
You can say that was the shortest one.
Okay. The next person that I think we should discuss is Krsta Misirkov. And Krsta Misirkov was a Bulgarian / Macedonian, I don't know what you want to call him, priest. He was definitely clerically affiliated. But what he really did is that he branched out into philosophy and into philology. So probably his most famous, and throughout his life, he alternated between supporting the idea of Vardar uniqueness and the idea of Bulgarian unity, right? When I say Bulgarian unity, I mean including Vardar. Right.
I'm sorry, what was Vardar?
Vardar, I'm using that as a reference term for Northern Macedonia.
Okay.
Because it's a word that's used often here, and it's sort of neutral because it doesn't have all the stuff attached to it. So, right. So,
Richard, I thought you were talking about Mordor, but like that's the wrong presentation. Just kidding.
Anyway, so on the question of Vardar, right. His seminal work, and this is a work that Macedonians today consider the conception of their identity, is the book on the right-hand side, right? Za Makedonskite Arabote on Macedonian matters. And this book was written actually in a dialect of the language that was spoken in Vardar, right? So he instead of writing it in Bulgarian or in Russian or some kind of neutral language, he actually decided to write it in what he considered should be a standardized Macedonian dialect, right? A standardized Macedonian language with its own unique spelling. In fact, the way that he wrote in this pamphlet has become generally accepted as the way that Macedonian is written today. There are some slight changes that occurred over the past 100 years, but generally speaking, that style of spelling. You can also see while he was living in what was then the Russian Empire, he tried to publish a magazine. He only published one issue of the magazine because he ran out of money, but it was called, but the magazine was called Vardar. You can see it in the center. And
what year, more or less, was this after the Bolsheviks or before?
This was before. He was writing, I think, on Macedonian matters. I think he wrote that in 1902.
That's 1906 here.
1906. Okay.
It's right there, right?
Yeah, there you go. Oh no, since 1903.
Oh,
That it actually says in Russia,
Yeah.
which is interesting. It was produced by a freedom club, Redefining group.
No. It says it in Macedonian. The thing is that it's close enough for you to understand it.
Right.
yeah,
So-
yeah.
Because Macedonian and Russian are very similar. I'm sure if you've ever traveled to Yugoslavia, you find it easy to communicate.
The language is similar, you're saying. The writing, this language.
The writing,
Everything.
the writing is slightly different. There are some letters that exist in Macedonian that don't exist in Russian, and vice versa. But basically, it's close enough that you can figure it out. I would say the closest example for you, Marika, would be Spanish and Portuguese. There are some letters in Portuguese that don't exist in Spanish. There's some letters in Spanish that don't exist in Portuguese. But the words are similar enough you can figure it out. And it's the same alphabet.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and you can see in the center that Vardar Science magazine that he tried to publish, as I said, the reason it stopped being published was not because of some government censorship or some inability to get authority or whatever. He simply ran out of money. These are the parts of his life that are, of course, taken by Macedonians as his contribution to the existence of a Macedonian culture, right? Because one of the things that the Macedonians kept being told was that you don't have a language, you speak Bulgarian, right? And so by saying, no, we actually have a Macedonian language, this is our Macedonian language, we're writing in it, right? It's a way to deal with that issue. All right. Now, the next part is going to get a little confusing if we haven't been confused before. So if we look at the map here, what we can see is the areas that are in dark color, those are the borders before 1912. And the areas that are in light color are the areas that were taken by 1913. So the Christian countries, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece, were, and to a lesser extent, Montenegro, were fighting against the Ottoman Empire, which controlled all those areas that are lighter. Now, the Ottoman Empire had nominal control over those territories, but they had very little ability to police the actions taking place there. So prior to 1912, while these territories were still nominally in the Ottoman world, you had Greek militias, Bulgarian militias, Serbian militias moving about these areas, conquering towns and villages, pulling back when the Ottoman forces came. In 1912, they decided, enough with this, we're going to actually launch a war and take the land. And that's exactly what happened. There's not a single battle that the Ottomans won in this entire war. There are some that they got to a standstill, or it was unclear who won the battle, but there was never a decisive Ottoman victory. There are a couple exceptions on the Greek front, but even those victories were very short-lived.
So what happened after the victory? What did it change? I mean, what did they?
All those borders. You can see all those areas that are lightly colored, right? The southern half of Serbia was added. The southern third of Bulgaria was added. The northern third of Greece was added. This was a massive victory for the Christian allies.
But for the people in the on the place, what did they change? I mean, do they?
Well, they got to take home a new flag. You know, it's very important.
Well, that for a new flag, God.
No, but it looks like North Macedonia is now becoming a country, right?
Well, no, North Macedonia is now part of Serbia.
It's part of Serbia?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
part of Serbia now. Serbia conquered it, right? So
Politically, is there any changes that happen? I mean, there is more repression, less repression, more.
we're gonna get to those
Okay.
results of the war. So now of course, as I just mentioned, the Serbians took Vardar and the Greeks took the Aegean Macedonia, and a small area in the lower side you can see is taken by Bulgaria, because I have the whole area of Macedonia on that left side map. Right, that's the whole of Macedonia. The Greeks took the south, Aegean Macedonia. The Serbians took the north, Vardar Macedonia, and the Bulgarians took the northeastern part. But of course, since we're talking about Vardar, we care about what happened in the Serbian part. So you can see on the left-hand side.
Excuse me, Richard. What about the Montenegro? What happened? Is that becomes part of what?
No. Montenegro is Montenegro.
It's independent at this point?
Yeah, it remains independent. You can see if you look on the map, Crna Gora.
Yeah, I see it. I see it.
Yeah, and you can also see that there's a little yellow area to the right of Crna Gora.
Right. What is that?
That's annexed by Montenegro during the conflict.
Oh,
right?
okay.
That was previously Ottoman territory. Now, because previously Montenegro and Serbia didn't have a border, now they have a border, right?
Okay.
Okay, so you can see on the left-hand side, these are Serbian cavalry entering Skopje. And when the Serbs came into Vardar, they engaged in a process called Serbianization. And Serbianization had several different aspects to it. The first was that you had Serbian colonists moving from the northern areas of Serbia, right? We can see that Serbia extends all the way to Belgrade. And there were a lot of Serbians in that northern part. They start moving into Vardar. We also have an attempt to tell anybody who sympathized with a Bulgarian identity in that area that they were Serbian and they had to renounce their Bulgarian identity or face expulsion. We also have the outlawing of the name Macedonia in that area. It was going to be called Vardar Banovina, and we'll see the map and it'll make a lot more sense. But so the word Macedonia to identify the people of the area and the word Bulgarian as an ethnic qualifier were both disallowed by the Serbian authorities. And with this influx of Serbian colonists, you begin to see a change in the general population. At the same time, the Greeks invading southern Macedonia evicted a significant portion of the Bulgarian speakers. And at the same time, the Bulgarians moving north evicted a number of Greek speakers from the area that they conquered. Eventually, in 1919, we're going to discuss this a little when we get there, there would be a population swap.
But wasn't it also a population swap with Turkey, no?
Yes, that will come later. That actually used this as a precedent.
Right.
So then we get to World War I.
One quick question before the World War I. So what were the big countries at the time? I mean, what was England siding with who? What was anybody was in, you know?
Nobody gave a crap.
They
Well,
didn't. No?
Russia helped earlier.
The Russians helped the Christian allies, but none of the. But I think you're reacting to this division of land. The great powers did not care about how the region of Macedonia was being carved between the victorious Christian powers. They were all happy that the Ottomans didn't have it anymore, but they didn't care which way it was being carved between those states.
But they didn't support the arms, they came from someplace, right?
Yeah, no, the arms came from the West, but again, it's not, I'm trying to find the right way to say this. They didn't withhold arms from any of the sides in this conflict.
Yeah, Russians supported Bulgarians a lot.
Yeah.
During the
Yeah.
time.
That was the Nikolai, literally, he was an incompetent king, but that thing he did support Bulgaria a lot. One thing I gotta add just quickly, I was recently, I don't know, stumbled across a textbook from those times, and Greeks had had done a lot of atrocities to those Bulgarian/Macedonians. There's a picture in a textbook somewhere where the Greek soldier gouging the eye of a Bulgarian soldier. And it was just like a torturous type of thing. So this was on the next level, like during the Yugoslavian wars in the 90s.
Exactly. No, we have numerous cases of villages being attacked, hundreds of people being slaughtered for refusing to renounce either Bulgarian identity or Greek identity or whatever identity it was that they had in territory that was now controlled by one of the other Christian powers. Then we had World War I. For those of us who skipped history class, the Serbians started it. There was the Black Hand, which was a Serbian terrorist organization. By the way, the Black Hand was involved in the Serbianization of Vardar and was responsible for the largest numbers of killings of Vardar Macedonians. The Black Hand assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And so, long story short, Austria-Hungary tries to invade Serbia in 1914 as retaliation. The 1914 invasion, for some reason that I still cannot understand, I'd like to talk to some military people about this someday, but they lose. The Serbians win the Austro-Hungarian invasion of 1914 when literally every statistic was against them. So
Yeah,
the Austrian,
I think Austro-Hungarians, they underestimated their resistance. They underestimated their army. They felt that they're going to just walk through them very easily, and that was one of the reasons they were surprised of this stiff resistance.
Regardless, though, in 1915, the Austro-Hungarians were sort of over-commanded by the Germans, and the Germans reached out to the Bulgarians, and so the three of them actually launched the invasion together, and all of Serbia, including Vardar, was taken. And you can see in the left-hand side, you see Austro-Hungary, their soldiers are executing Serbian civilians. The Serbian population, which includes Vardar, during the First World War was cut down by a third. That's not a military casualty number, that is a population number. 1/3 of Serbians did not survive the war. And it's a combination of the military being overrun, numerous people trying to flee the new occupational governments. It comes from lack of food because of how many areas were destroyed during the war. It comes from a whole bunch of reasons, but in Serbia and in Vardar, this was a great Holocaust in the sense of how much of the population was just removed from existence. And it's still a very painful memory in both Serbia and Vardar. The Allies tried to mount a resistance to this, but basically gave up and only maintained the line at Greece, where you can see the map, those blue arrows, where Greece was kept relatively unoccupied, but Serbia and Vardar were taken. All right. As a result of the end of World War I, and Bulgaria was a central power, right? They were allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, as you pointed out. They were required to give up land. And this was the Treaty of Neuilly-sur-Seine, which was a location in France, where this treaty was signed. You can see in red all the areas that Bulgaria was required to give up under the treaty, which included the western part of Thrace, which was their entire access to the Aegean Sea. And this is what set up that population exchange that we talked about in 1919, where 46,000 Greeks were expelled from Bulgaria, and 92,000 Bulgarians were expelled from Aegean Macedonia and from Western Thrace into Bulgaria, right? And of those 92,000 Bulgarians, for certain, there are people who we could retroactively consider Macedonians, right? Because they exist on that continuum of Bulgarian language speech, which, especially if they're coming from the Western areas, would have sounded a lot more like the people in Macedonia today than the people in Sofia or the people in Plovdiv. As Greg pointed out, there was a population exchange between Greeks and Turks in 1923 after the Turkish War of Independence. And that exchange of populations was modeled actually on this exchange of populations between Greece and Bulgaria. All right. So then we move into
one comment, Richard. I found it kind of interesting that 100 years before, I mean, all the Europeans, especially the British, the French, they were traveling to Greece, to Rome, and they, I mean, the whole mythology, the whole idea was that they were the basics of, you know, democracy and all that bullshit, right? All that, I mean, well, I don't know.
I know what you're driving at. That
yeah.
they're fundamental.
How do they not cited by the Greeks? Because if you take the writings of 50 years before, all the Europeans were, you know, saying that the Greeks and the Romans were the whole basics of democracy, blah, 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 blah. How do they didn't participate? I find it strange.
They in World War I, they participated. They sent soldiers there. That was part of the war. But in terms of these population exchanges and mechanics and all these kinds of things, generally speaking, that was not what was important to them, right? You have actually a lot of romantics from Western Europe, like Lord Byron, right? Although he's sort of the exception here. Who write about Greece being the fundament of civilization and
democracy, blah, blah, blah.
And yeah, right. And they go there and they discover, oh, these are a bunch of backwards village people who are incredibly authoritarian, close-minded, anti-modern. What happened? Like,
and he died there, right?
Well, no, I mean, Lord Byron.
He died in Greece.
Yeah, but Lord Byron's reaction was the opposite. He was like, if we fight and we secure Greek independence, then by glory, they'll return to their civilization, because under the Ottomans, they're prevented from expressing themselves. Thankfully, he didn't survive the war, and he didn't see what the Kingdom of Greece became, which is exactly what he found. Like, people don't magically change all of a sudden under a new government. They're the same people. They just have a new government.
Right. I mean, if you read something that they wrote before, it was like all laws to Greek and Roman. I mean, everything was Greek and Roman, and we should model, I mean, not only in everything, architecture, art, everything was you know, how great they were. And then nothing. Yeah. I guess that's what you said.
Yeah.
I find it so strange.
Yeah, no, the thing is that whenever, but this is not unique to Greece and Rome, right? Whenever we talk about any society, we tend to have in our minds a focused nature of how it was at insert age here, depending on the mythology we want to create, right? Whenever we talk to patriots, quote unquote, about the United States, right? They tell us about what was going on in 1776, as if like that was the only moment that this country ever existed. And they don't talk about, for example.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, about the indigenous people.
They don't talk about, you know, what I really believe about America is that America had the Great Depression. And the Great Depression symbolizes our lack of capitalist vitality and our need to have functioning social projects. Like this is not the conversation that you have. You have this sort of idealized and crystallized view of what US is. And in the same way, when Europeans at this time, Western Europeans, were talking about Greece, their vision of Greece was a Greece that hadn't existed for 2,000 years. They weren't thinking about, because we went through, right? We went through the Byzantines, and we went through the Ottomans, and we went through the breaking of the Rum Millet, and we went through the Balkan Wars, and now we're at World War I, right? Those aren't the Greeces that they're thinking of, right?
Right.
It's the same.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Okay.
Got it.
So now we move to the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And the kingdom was basically a combination of South Slavs that did not want to be in the same room together. So they did the best thing that they could. They found a king who would proclaim no ethnic nationality. His name was Karađorđević. And the names of all of the regions were ripped of any ethnic nomenclature, right? Which is why you have Dravska, Savska, Vrbavska, Primorska, Dunavska, Drinska, Zetska, Moravska, and Vadarska. Like, they're literally named after the biggest river that they could find.
All ska.
Yeah. No, but all these regions, if you look at the map, this map looks almost nothing like the current borders in the former Yugoslav states. There are some slight things, like, for example, the border between Savska and Vrbavska looks very similar to the border between Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina today, but that's about it, right? You don't see the southern part of Croatia being delineated. You don't see Montenegro as an independent entity. You don't see Serbia. Like, all these things are just completely cut up and rearranged. And the goal here was to create some sort of unified Southern Slavic state that wouldn't be privy to these ethnic tensions and difficulties. And so Karađorđević, Alexander I Karađorđević, was the king until he was assassinated assassinated in 1930, and he was assassinated by Vlado Chernozemski. You can see him in the center. Vlado Chernozemski was an advocate for the independence of Vardar Macedonia, and he didn't like this idea of ripping out that identity. In Bulgaria, of course, he's celebrated as a Bulgarian freedom fighter. In Macedonia today, he's seen as another person in the long list of martyrs who died for the independence of Macedonia. Regardless, after Karađorđević died, you had this system was more or less maintained until the Nazis invaded in 1941. So you had this sort of attempt to de-ethnicize. And remember, ever since the Serbian invasion of Vardar, the term Macedonia for this region was outlawed. It was illegal, and it remained illegal under King Alexander I.
It's interesting, Richard. You mentioned that it did remain illegal, but the concentration of the policemen in the area of Macedonia, especially outside there was a hate for Croats as well, but they were saying there was 1 million people living in that area, and there was 40,000 to 50,000 policemen policing the whole area, and they were mostly Serbian.
Yeah,
and that's what drove. Even though there was split in this matter, there was a almost genocidal type of behavior from Serbs against Croats and Macedonians in that regard.
I think genocide is a little strong, but there was definitely cultural assimilation, colonization, and repudiation of local identity. Something closer to cultural genocide than physical genocide.
Right, exactly.
All right. So once we move into World War II, we have a new division of Yugoslavia, because the kingdom of when Yugoslavia was invaded, Yugoslavia was not an ally of the Nazis, but there were two allies of the Nazis that were very close to Yugoslavia, which was one being Hungary, the other one being Bulgaria. So you can see Hungary and Bulgaria took over parts of former Yugoslavia, and the majority of Vardar came under Bulgarian occupation. You also had the creation of the Ustaše, which is listed as the independent state of Croatia, which is ironic because it was a puppet state. Montenegro was an Italian protectorate, and Serbia itself was put under direct German military authority. So in order to liberate those areas from Nazi occupation, you had to create a unified front. And that's what Joseph Tito did. Joseph Broz, his nickname was Tito. You can see him on the left-hand side and in the center with some of his partisans. Their goal was to unify the various Yugoslav nations in order to oust the Nazis. And contrary to the previous policy of not noticing the ethnic divisions in Yugoslavia, Tito took the unorthodox position of recognizing those distinctions. So he recognized Serbs, he recognized Slovenes, he recognized Croats, he recognized what we would today call Bosniaks. At that time, he just called them Muslims, Muslim Slavs, and Montenegrins. The hardest group for him to get on his side was Vardar Macedonians. And so he sent the man on the right-hand side here, Svetozar Vukmanovic, who's also known by the name Tempo. He sent him, he was Montenegrin, to go to Vardar Macedonia and link with the rebels there. The rebels there were led by a man named Metodia Andonov, who's also called Cento. And Cento had a very strong Macedonian nationalistic aspiration. And throughout the fight against the Germans, this was fine, right? Tito needed everybody he could on his side. And so an alliance with somebody who had the same enemy was functional at that point. There came a point, however, after Vardar was liberated, that Tempo ordered Cento to move against opposition in Serbia to help unify Yugoslavia together. And Cento disagreed. He wanted to march south on Greece and take Aegean Macedonia to unify Macedonia as a new Macedonian state. At this moment, Tempo arrested Cento and effectively replaced him. You also have massacres that go on throughout Vardar Macedonia, led by Serbs, of anybody who wants to assert this independent Macedonian identity and independent Macedonian country. And that action, because it takes place in late December, is called Bloody Christmas. Around 1,000 people were killed, many more were imprisoned. And Tempo put another Macedonian named Lazar Kolishevsky in charge of running the Yugoslav state of Macedonia, the Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And he was effectively in charge of that area for the next 25 years, formatting and creating a Yugoslav Macedonian identity.
Richard, one addition, I apologize, I may have come a little late, but since Bulgaria was part of the axis of evil, they annexed Macedonia in their favor.
Right, that's what I showed on this map.
Right.
And when you said that Tito recognized all these different groups, how did he, I mean, how did he make them work? I mean, what did he do?
By the force of his own personality and by...
That's a very big personality, but
Let
how?
me tell you about Tito, okay? When he was a president of Yugoslavia, he used to, first of all, he knew 8 or 9 languages. He had 8 newspapers were given to him every day from different, like London Times, New York Times, whatever it is. He would read them all every morning. That's how intelligent this person was. And he was very like an all-around person. This guy is larger than life.
How did he do it? I mean, I would love to learn how he did it.
There were a few things that I can say about him in terms of why his partisans respected him. The first one is that in almost all of his speeches, he referred to the various ethnicities, right? He would say, you know, here, Croats, Muslims, and Serbs have died in defense of our freedom, right? Like he would say things like that as opposed to my people or whatever. He would list out these different groups so they all felt connected. Then in his inner circle, he didn't discriminate. So if you were qualified and you happened to be, because he was Serbian ethnically, but like if you were in his inner circle and you were Slovene, fantastic. If you were in his inner circle and you were Montenegrin, fine. Like whatever it was, if you had the ability, you were in. And so people knew that he was honest and that he was fair in terms of how he would treat everybody. So it was things like that that combined with the kind of larger than life persona that he both had in person and created for himself in the communist state he developed afterwards. He held Yugoslavia together by the force of his personality and by that sort of honor system, which is why when he died, Yugoslavia began to fall apart. It had a lot to do with who he was. All right. So now while Kolishevsky was leading Vardar Macedonia, he created Macedonian Historiography. And he was supported in this by Vasil Ivanovsky. And Vasil Ivanovsky, his main job was to create the Macedonian identity further back in history than it had previously existed. And so we have a few examples about how, starting in the 1960s and moving forward, the Macedonians completely rewrote some of the history in their neck of the woods. A few examples that I want to show. For example, this is an inscription from Bitola, which is in southern Vardar today. And in Bitola, you had the Kometopoli, which it was an empire of Slavic-speaking people around 1,000 years ago. And they are generally identified as Bulgarian. The Macedonian historiographers re-identified them as Macedonian and were exhibiting this stone, which is an accurate stone. It was found in Bitola, which was part of the Kometopoli Empire. But they were saying that it demonstrated that they identified as Macedonian. And then somebody actually read the stone and found that the stone has the Kometopoli literally saying, "We are the Bulgarian Empire." Right? Like you literally cannot square this circle. And so as soon as they discovered that it said something that was contrary to the narrative that they had constructed, they just hid the stone. Because why let facts interfere with reality?
Richard, but it's people born in the same place, but it's called Macedonian, it's called Bulgar, it's called, and that's the whole fight. What are we called?
Yeah.
Which is incredible dumb.
You would think. And yet a lot of people are invested in this. Although, as Aaron's going to point out, fewer and fewer people are invested in this for exactly the reason you point out. Another example of Macedonian historiography. This is a picture from 1941. This is not a doctored picture. This is an accurate picture. In 1941, as Zach pointed out, the Bulgarians invaded Vardar. And generally speaking, you can see the way that the people are reacting to the Bulgarian invasion. It's with pomp and circumstance, that they're generally happy. And that makes perfect sense considering the way that the Serbians had been treating them, the Serbianization that we talked about from 1913 until 1941 was incredibly oppressive, and the Bulgarians spoke the same language as they did, and or more or less the same language as they did, and they were generally well seen. The Bulgarians didn't have to station a lot of soldiers in Vardar because, generally speaking, the people there accepted the occupation. But of course, since this is now a Serbian-run Yugoslavia that's creating this Macedonian historiography, the Bulgarians have to be recaptured as oppressors, and that's what's going. So, in contrary to this sort of photographic evidence, you then had to create a narrative of the Serbians liberating these Macedonians from their Bulgarian oppressors. Much of the Macedonian historiography that starts at this period and continues to today is designed to split the Macedonian identity from the Bulgarian identity. So then, of course, with Tito's death and a few other changes, like the Macedonia becomes independent. Notice how this is still actually a month before the Berlin Wall falls, right? This is partially due to the changes that are occurring in the Soviet world, but Yugoslavia has always been in a non-aligned system. So their sort of collapse of Yugoslavia occurred even before the rest of the Soviet bloc fell. Now, this is from modern Macedonia. You can see this is a Google Maps picture. And you can see on the right-hand side, you have the Museum of the Macedonian Struggle. And there's no accident that literally right across the street is the Museum of Archaeology, right? Because the government in Skopje, Skopje being the capital of Vardar, the government in Skopje wants to create the link between the archaeology of ancient Macedonia and the concept of modern Macedonia, right? And you can see this is on the lower left is a picture from inside the museum. It's I wish I had pictures of the inside of the museum because I've been there before and I wanted to take pictures very badly, but it's illegal.
Well, the outside looks like I mean, it looks like a hotel, you know, like in the suburbs. I mean, that kind of the Museum of the Macedonian Struggle looks like I don't know, I don't remember the names of the hotels, but here in the States, I mean.
Yeah, no, it looks like a Marriott or a Sheraton, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But on the inside, you can see the picture. That's the only picture I could find of the inside, and that should give you an idea. You have maquettes and paintings and illustrations that try to thread all of these individuals or places or ideas to create a coherent Macedonian history, regardless of whether the individuals in it would have seen themselves as Macedonian, fighting for Macedonian independence, or any of the other attributes that are ascribed to them in that museum. And so Macedonia is still continuing to create its own narrative of its identity. The thing that I always find so surprising about this is that the Macedonians have more than a century of their own oppression at the hands of Greeks, Bulgarians, and Serbs to create a modern sense of identity. They could do that. They don't need to argue that, 800 years ago, there were people identifying as Macedonians in order for that to be a legitimate nationality today. But that's what the government in Skopje feels is necessary.
By the way, that museum, it's a little bit like in a Greek style, right? On the other side of the river, right? The Museum of Archaeology.
Yeah, a little bit.
It's built.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One looks like a Holiday Inn, and the other one looks like from
Well,
Rome.
Museum of Archaeology is the one on the left side.
Right.
It's
Yes.
across the.
Bridge.
I also been. It's pretty pretty interesting. There are some good stuff there too. I mean, this is.
And if you could actually see through the Museum of the Macedonian Struggle, like if it was invisible or just removed, you would see the statue of Alexander the Great that I showed at the very beginning of my presentation. So
Yeah.
that's also in the center of Skopje, which is part of that Macedonian narrative making that
Right.
that they're a continuation of
Yeah.
that.
And Philip,
Richard.
as well, right?
Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Yeah,
You mentioned that the government trying to create Macedonian identity. And what is the main reason for doing that?
Why should they be independent if they don't have an identity? That's the argument.
But they're already independent, you know. What are they afraid somebody might invade a country?
Well, we're going to talk about how they feel that their identity is being compromised today, and their independence is being compromised today. The first major issue is from the Greek side, and you have what's called the naming controversy. So the Greeks actually petitioned the United Nations starting in 1992 that they could not accept Macedonia as the name of an independent country because Macedonia is the name of that region in Greece. And the use of the term Macedonia is like stealing Greek historical identity and applying it to a Slavic people that it doesn't belong to. There are all kinds of metaphors that I've seen used on the internet to represent the Greek position. It's like, imagine a thief came into your house and then started wearing all your jewelry walking down the street. And then everybody was like, wow, what great jewelry that guy has. So in order to be admitted to the United Nations, Macedonia had to use this placeholder name called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, or FYROM. So you can see on the map here, the FYROM label, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And that was the only way that they were allowed to enter international organizations. They also had what they called the Vergina sun flag. There's an, I forgot to put a picture of this, but there's an emblem on the shield of Alexander the Great, which is of a sun with radiating lines in all directions. And the Macedonians used that as their first independent flag. And the Greeks refused to allow that flag to be flown because they considered it appropriation of Alexander the Great, who was Southern Macedonian. And therefore,
the Greeks in the past, they didn't want to recognize Alexander the Great. And now they want to say that Alexander the Great was really Greek.
yeah, exactly.
I mean, they changed their mind 2,000 years to.
So you can see from the Macedonian position, from the Vardar position, that this is a power game. It has nothing to do with how Greeks really feel about these things. It has nothing to do with what history actually was or is, or how it can be understood. It has everything to do with Greece trying to flex its muscle because of its own internal politics or issues or whatever. And this is a way that Greeks can show power, right? So that's the Vardar position, and the Greek position is that this is our history and it's being appropriated. So and so they demanded that Macedonia stop using the Vergina sun flag, and instead now they use a different version. So it looks it's still a sun, it's still a round circle with lines coming out of it, but now the lines are more stylized, and so it doesn't look like the Vergina sun. In 2001, this is really the only time that, because Vardar Macedonia has about a 20% Albanian minority, especially in the last 50 years, as Albanians fled Albania under the Hoxha government and came to Vardar Macedonia and other parts of Yugoslavia when it was still the Yugoslavia. So there was some overflow during the Yugoslav-Kosovo wars into the northern parts of Vardar. You can see the areas just to the north of Tetovo, and that there are flashpoints to the northwest of Kumanovo. By and large, the Albanian population in Vardar has stayed out of the three-way fighting between the Serbs, the Greeks, and the Bulgarians. But there is some revanchist view, especially in the westernmost and northernmost areas of Vardar, that these should become part of a greater Albanian state. And so Vardar has had to contend with that issue as well, especially since the Albanian population is growing more quickly than the Slavic Macedonian population. Then you have the Bulgarians, and the Bulgarians today continue to argue that Vardar Macedonia is part of Bulgaria. It's linguistically and socially part of Bulgaria. You can see this is a map from the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and it's a show of the dialects of the Bulgarian language. All the colors here represent speakers of Bulgarian. And you can notice that they include areas of southern Macedonia as well, right? because those people were expelled from Greece, but some small populations remain, as well as in Turkey. But you can see that the entire country of Macedonia, even in areas where the dialect is so radically different, like in the western area, that it's different from any comparable dialect in Bulgaria, that it's still shaded in as if it's part of Greater Bulgaria. There's also an issue that many people in Vardar want to get an EU passport because it will allow them to work anywhere in Europe. And Bulgaria is a member of the EU, while Vardar Macedonia is not. So a lot of Macedonians are crossing the border into Bulgaria. And of course, Bulgaria says, of course you're Bulgarian. Why don't you get a Bulgarian passport, surrender your Macedonian passport, and truly embrace who you are? And so a lot of Macedonians are surrendering their Macedonian passports because the Bulgarian passport is that much stronger. And then Bulgaria has used the argument that now 80,000 Vardar Macedonians have surrendered their Vardar nationality, which shows that the nationality is a farce, right? That Vardar.
So the Macedonians, they lose their citizenship in Macedonia.
They're choosing to give up their citizenship in Macedonia,
Right, right.
because they want to work in the European Union.
Right. But if they go to Macedonia, they work in Europe, they make money, and then they want to go back to Macedonia and have their house, right? But can they go? What's
Absolutely. Once they go to Skopje and they say, I'm Macedonian, look, this is my driver's license, or this is my other ID or whatever that I kept. And they'll be like, oh yeah, of course, because Macedonia doesn't recognize the forfeiture, right? Because Macedonia argues that this is a Bulgarian attempt to steal the nationality of Macedonians.
Okay, so you have dual citizenship in a way.
In a way, but you can't. But you can't have it while recognizing your Bulgarian.
In reality, you have it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but the thing is that Bulgaria can use this and say, see, these people really believe that they're Bulgarians. Why else would they forsake their nationality?
Well, because they change their minds.
I have heard that Bulgarians getting a lot of lashback for them blocking the admittance of Macedonia into European Union.
Right. No, because at first it was the Greeks, and then we're going to see why the Greeks sort of are pulling back, and now it's the Bulgarians, and so the Bulgarians are getting pushed back because they're the only EU member state that's really causing an admissions issue at this point.
Right.
This reminds me of Crimea citizens that have both Ukrainian and Russian passport.
Exactly.
Passport, you can go anywhere.
Right. Yeah, all these passports and you still can't leave. So in 2018, in 2017, there was a referendum in Macedonia. And the referendum was the specific language that occurred on the top. Are you in favor of European and NATO membership by accepting an agreement between the Republic of Macedonia and the Republic of Greece? I think there's a slight ending of on changing the name, which was a really anomalous referendum question because it doesn't explain anything about what's actually being done.
On changing, I'm sorry, what did you say then?
On changing the name, right? Because Greece opposes the name Macedonia.
Right.
So they have to change the name.
Okay.
Right? Now, according to the Macedonian constitution, in order for a referendum to be binding, you need at least 50% turnout. Because the referendum was written in such a strange way, and a lot of Macedonians want to say, but what would the name change be? What name are we signing on to? The amount of people who actually voted was 36.89%, so less than the 50% necessary. But of those who voted, 94% said yes. So the Macedonian government accepted this as a mandate that they could go into negotiations with the Greeks and change the name. So and so the referendum took place, and then and then afterwards you had what was called the Prespa Agreement, and in the Prespa Agreement, Greece would agree to withhold it would stop its attempts at withholding North Macedonia from joining the European Union, and Macedonia would accept the name North Macedonia as their official name. Now, the name was not ratified by the Macedonian people. It was strictly an in-government procedure, and it wasn't ratified like a treaty would. It was ratified like any other piece of legislation, which requires a much lower vote margin. So many Macedonians believe that this treaty is illegitimate because they would not have chosen the name North Macedonia. And even if they would have, they don't want the Greeks forcing them to choose that name. The Greeks, on the other hand, also don't like this treaty by and large, because they don't like the fact that the name Macedonia is anywhere in the name. So the fact that the two governments are okay with it doesn't mean that the peoples are in any way okay with it. Regardless, the fact that the governments are okay with it paves the way for them to enter the European Union.
It looks like a soccer teams, you know, that regardless of whatever, is you're always part of your team, and wow, God.
Yeah. A couple points that, because there was a man, Andrei Ristevsky, who Zach put us in touch with, who is Macedonian, and there were two basic points that he wanted to communicate. I don't know if he's here with us, but if he isn't, I guess he isn't, because he's not.
He wasn't able to. I don't know where he is. Sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. The two major points is that, as I pointed out before, the referendum in 2018 was done inconsistently with the terms of the Macedonian constitution, right? It was done with the purpose of trying to make acceptable something that was in violation of the constitutional terms. And sorry? And was therefore unacceptable to most Macedonians because it lacked even the veneer of democratic legitimacy, right? It looked like an intentional sham. And related to that was sort of a second point, is that in most democracies, there is a delta between what the population wants, if you were to survey them, and what the government is doing in terms of its choices, right? And that delta exists, but it exists to an even greater degree in Macedonia than what you would expect in a country that elects its leaders, right? Macedonians feel generally that the government doesn't care about what their aspirations are and will simply do whatever is most diplomatically expedient for them, regardless of how people feel. And it creates a sense of unease and a sense of distrust with governmental institutions because they really can't be bothered to help the people out.
Now I know.
Whether they have a president elected by, I mean, popular vote, or
Yeah, you know, the parties are there are different, like any other democracy. They have multiple political parties with different political perspectives. They have a prime minister. Is the president or prime minister?
is it compulsory? Compulsory that they is not compulsory to vote. I mean, you don't.
It is not compulsory to vote.
Okay.
But no, they have different political parties. They have a parliament and a prime minister. They have they have an independent judiciary. They have all of the things that democratic republics have, but their goals post-election and in the government are generally ones that alienate their population rather than support their needs and desires. And you can think of it very similarly to the way that most in the United States don't like the party they vote for anyway, right? Most people who are conservative don't like what the Republicans are doing. And most people who are left-wing don't like what the Democrats are doing. They like them better than the other party, but they don't like them.
Well, plus there's not a popular vote, plus that, you know, there's not compulsory to vote, so.
Yeah.
But you're saying that the general feeling is that the government doesn't represent what the people want.
Correct. Even though they have, at least on paper and nominally, the ability to vote for diverse democratic parties. And unlike, for example, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where their government is an organizational cavalcade that is a quasi-democracy, Macedonia has much less of an excuse.
So what does a Bulgarian now claim?
The Bulgarian government still claims that Vardar Macedonia is a historic part of Bulgaria, that they speak Bulgarian, and that the only reason that they're independent is because Serbia conquered them back in 1944.
Oh,
That's what they argue.
so basically Macedonia is screwed, or North Macedonia. In this
Well, it depends whether the European Union is going to put leverage on Bulgaria because they want to bring all of Europe into the Union, and they're basically going to tell Bulgaria, you can have whatever nationalistic crap within your own borders, but when it comes to international policy, North Macedonia will be an independent and recognized state within the European Union.
Yeah, it's
Are they part of European Union now? Not.
Bulgaria and Greece are. Macedonia is not.
Okay. And
And-
NATO?
What?
And NATO? What about NATO?
I don't think Macedonia is part of NATO, but I don't have. I
Okay.
can't check right now. Yeah.
But is Greece part of NATO?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I forgot about that.
Greece was one of the founding members of NATO.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Yeah, Turkey and Greece part of NATO.
Yeah. No, like the thing, one of the things that I didn't mention, and maybe I should have, is that in 1946, right, when Greece was dealing with the communist insurgency, there was a huge support for the communist insurgency among the remaining Macedonian Slavic populations in Greek Macedonia, because of the possibility of reuniting with communist Yugoslavia.
Wow. Interesting.
So what about this whole idea of how to create this continuity with ancient Macedonia in the North Macedonia? That's what Greeks are objecting to, but I know there's been a lot of effort to do that, to kind of rewrite maybe conveniently something like in previous years. I don't know if they're still continuing that.
No, Macedonians, the Macedonian government in Skopje is still continuing to promote the idea that they are the current government of Macedonia is not making the argument that they are the descendants of the ancient Macedonians. They're making the argument that they are the descendants of the Slavic immigrants who came in the 600s. That said,
but also mingled with ancient population.
Right.
So I don't know if the DNA tests were made sufficiently to see one way or the other, but I would think that this northern part of Macedonia was not the Macedonia proper in ancient times. It was Paionians who lived there and the Illyrians. So
I would think Illyrians more than Pannonians. Pannonians are much further north.
No, not Pannonians, Paionians.
Okay.
Paionians, that's another group that the Thracian tribes that was mostly occupied there. Skopje was the richest kind of center at some point.
Okay.
Why not call it Spartacus country? Wasn't Spartacus Thracian?
Yeah, he was Thracian. I don't know, but but that was much later. We're talking about way before Spartacus, where it's actually Philip II who conquered that area. Prior to that, it was not part of Macedonia. Prior to Philip, it was Paionians and Illyrians or Dardanis. These are the. But anyway, I don't know. It's kind of seems to be a little bit stretch, because they're not just they admit that they're Slavic, but they're also saying that they kind of mingled with the locals, so they are as Macedonians in southern Macedonia, because in southern Macedonia they're mostly Greek, because there was this population swap with Turkey. It was massive. A lot of it went to northern Greece, southern Macedonia, what they call.
Yeah, the whole thing is weird. I mean,
Yeah,
we have something like this very close in Asia Minor, in former Soviet republics, because they didn't really exist. None of them existed. They were just new republics, and people are trying to trace their roots. Like Uzbekistan claims that Timur Lame was related to them. He was not related in any way to
Yeah, no.
Uzbeks.
No, the thing is that we know where we actually know where the Uzbeks came from, but they did, yeah, but Timur was not Uzbek.
Yeah, it was nothing to do with Uzbek. It was Turkic and Mongol. And so then they have all those monuments. You've been to Uzbekistan.
Yep.
It's weird. So it's the same thing. And now we go to Kazakhstan. They say Timur Lame is their guy. And then you go to Tajikistan. They do Amara Hayam and all these people. It's just weird. It's all over the place. And it was all predates the arrival of new tribes into that area, so to speak. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I have to say that in Skopje, these statues of Alexander and Philip with the family, they're gigantic. They're like, oh my God.
No, they're like the size of a car.
Car? What car?
No, they are the size of a car.
No, I mean the whole monuments. They're gigantic.
monument,
This. Alexander. It's way up there. I mean, right? You remember? And the Philip. There is the whole family there, right? I don't know if you have that.
But you can see Alexander.
Yeah, I know, but you don't understand. Like
I think we saw it in another presentation. There was a huge
it's like
statue
10-story building, like the height
yeah.
of 10-story building. That's how high it is.
Well, it's Alexander the Great. So.
Right. And also Philip with his family is also as big on the other side of that promenade across the river. It's kind of says something about the ego, about the statement, the size of this monuments. Probably has they wanted to show something.
Yeah. Aaron, did you want to talk about the sort of EU identity that's sort of taking hold? Aaron, are you?
Aaron.
All right, I'll speak on his behalf then, and it'll take about 500% less time. So, one of the other major things because we've talked about 4 sort of pulls on the Macedonian identity, right? We have the Greek pull, we have the Bulgarian pull, the Serbian pull, the Macedonian independence pull. There's actually a 5th pull that we didn't really discuss, and that's the European Union and sort of that locus of identity. And that increasingly, for the very eloquent reason of it being stupid, as Marika pointed out, a lot of kids in Macedonia today, what they care about is, a house with a white picket fence and 2 kids and being able to sustain everybody and just enjoying life. And the European Union is the vehicle through which to achieve that, right? It's much easier to get that kind of job in Germany or in France or wherever, or to be part of the European Union and bring those goods to Macedonia for everybody.
And it gets paid better too with the exchange. So that's the big thing.
Right, exactly. So there's this sort of abandonment in a lot of my generation and the generation after me of this very particularized Macedonian identity, or whichever nationality is trying to pull on the Macedonian identity. So
I think Aaron is back.
yeah, Aaron, you here?
He stepped out. I mean, his
We
screen
see
is
his
blank.
head.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, he is here. He's
Aaron,
he's getting ready.
Okay. So, but so they're part of this new bureaucracy, and they're checking out of this Balkans identity cluster puzzle.
Richard,
Yeah.
and you know so much about history. I mean, is this kind of a little bit too much about these nationalities and this, I mean, the Kosovo War and everything is, it's like everything is to the extreme. Is that, or this is part of any other place in history?
I'm not sure I understand.
I mean, this, you know, you're born in the same place, you're so close, and you're enemies, you know.
Well,
this,
I mean, I think, Marika, that what you're saying is this, and sorry about that, guys. I stepped out, I got something to eat and I didn't realize. Sorry. I think that the challenge is that we see the Balkans inside Europe, and Europe is within the Balkans, right? So it's all coexisting there, and we're assuming a certain modernity, you know, politically, socially, culturally. And while there's a elite and I would even say a larger than elite, like a broader middle class and above within that region that really wants to be European or is European, but wants to be part of it's called the European institution. That there is this deep cultural sort of nationalism that is very fundamental, and it's not unique to the Balkans, right? You have it in, you know, almost everywhere in the world, but because of the fragmentation, how atomic it is, right? And the topography, you know, like it's not a plane, right? That a single empire can just sort of flatten everything all at once very easily. And so, especially in the modern world, so you have really these permanent set of sects, almost like the way we think of religious sects, but they're ethno-nationalists, and they're never strong enough to dominate forever, but they're never weak enough that they sort of disappear. And I think in the modern world with technology, they'll almost never disappear. Because you can maintain your own identity, whatever you want to define it as. And if there's enough people, you know, and remember, a lot of these places aren't really large. I mean, they don't have tens, hundreds of millions of people. They have, you know, small numbers of people in the hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, maybe in the low millions. So you just don't need a large population that believes in a particular ethno-religious nationalism to sustain that. You know, and of course, we have enough symbols in the modern world, flags, songs, monuments, you know, things like that, you know, historical leaders, as Richard has gone over, that you can kind of graft that on top of that identity, and it sort of sticks. And I think that's something that this region, in some ways, this region birthed this at the scale that it did. And it keeps birthing. And I think that's what makes it a little more unique, and is that it has a renewal to this, right? It's not like a one-time thing, and that it's sort of, and of course, when you do a one-time thing, it looks really old after 200 or 300 years. But when you do this constant rebirthing of you know, which means it gets attached to things that are a little more modern, you know, you get that small percentage that really connects with it. And that's what you have. I mean, obviously, some of those populations are getting older and dying off and so on, but that's a slow process, right? Especially, you know, thankfully, it's not that violent anymore outside of the Yugoslavian wars. But that means these people live a long time, right? They keep 30, 50 years of that, or 100 years of that ethno-nationalism, and which means it doesn't change.
I'm
So,
sorry,
I don't know if
there's
that
a
makes
lot
sense.
of noise. I mean,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, it's a lot of noise. Do we hear that?
Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry. So I don't know, Marika, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
no,
to
no.
you.
For me, the question is why people can get so obsessed with this name.
Because
you know?
it's your identity. It's your identity. It's what
Yeah,
you
but
attach
your
to.
identity, we're all from the same world, and your
Yeah.
identity is very superficial. I mean, it's very.
Well, no, it's. I mean, we are from the same physical planet, but the perspectives that all of us bring to that planetary experience are wildly different depending on the way we lens it, right? The way we lens it through religion, the way we lens it through science, the way we lens it through personal experience, all of these kinds of things. And so our experience of the world, we're using this word to explain to other people what that experience is in a way that they can understand it.
But
You know,
I
I
agree
think-
with you. I agree with that only if you are from far away and you don't know the people. But this is people who have been living together,
Yeah,
But-
sharing
Marika,
this place.
you,
And
you
then,
know, I know what you're saying, but I think nationalism usually rises up in the face of a threat of losing that identity. That's what usually happens. You know, like for instance, German nationalism during the Hitler was a result of humiliation, and you know, it's the same thing. I mean, things that's happening in Russia right now also a result of humiliation that happened after the collapse. So in case of North Macedonia and all of those republics, that national identity was suppressed because they were trying to create the general identity, Yugoslavian identity. You know, once it's all failed, you know, and all the wars started, and there is a threat, and you have to really justify the way of your existence and independence, and that's the result of it, you know. And the
Okay.
brothers usually fight the harshest. You know how it goes in the family.
yeah. That's-
Well, and the other thing too is that we make an assumption, just like Greg was saying, that when you have proximity, that you will have more understanding. But the understanding that you can have can often be more extreme, right? Because a great example of this is that when you know the little code words that people use to reference you, you know, the little zingers that they have around, you know, why you're bad and why, you know, they're good and so on. You build this, like, think of it as a grievance engine or a resentment engine. It becomes easier to build that, actually, because you can point out, oh, look what they did. They didn't include our symbol. They didn't include our coat of arms. You know, they stepped on our flag.
I'm sure that it's exploited by people who want to get power, and that's the easiest thing. But yeah, just I get it.
Well, yeah, and I think one thing that becomes very unique in the modern world in this region is that the populations, because of the impact of communism or the versions of communism, can often be not extremely religious, but symbolically religious. In essence, using the symbolism of religion, you know, as sort of a reference point underneath their ethno-nationalism or under their little, it's basically tribalism is what it is, really. And that becomes really powerful, right? Because there's a legitimacy that's conveyed. Because it's one thing to say that's a bad person over there. I don't agree with their right to have their own, you know, kind of movement or whatever. But once there's an attachment to an underlying a religious authority, directly or indirectly, it becomes more dangerous when you challenge that. And because it conveys a legitimacy, it attaches a legitimacy.
It makes it something that's not human created. It makes it something
That's right.
that exists as a natural part of the universe, right?
That's exactly right.
We're Greek because of all these factors. I didn't choose to be Greek.
Yeah.
I
Destiny.
am Greek.
Yeah, destiny made me Greek, right? It's sort of like, and that's what you get. You get destiny movements, basically. And I think that's the collision. The collision you have is you have a lot of self-belief in the destiny movements that are extremely powerful. And really the only answer, if we're going to be honest, and nobody really talks about this, is that outside the French, everyone else for 30 years in Europe has put their head in the sand when it comes to the Balkans, which is probably, I mean, I'd say it's even a larger failure in some ways than things that have happened in Eastern Europe, because I think Eastern Europe might be uneven, and obviously Ukraine is sort of the base case of that. Most of Eastern Europe at least has these sort of trajectories into the European Union and into sort of the norms. But the Balkans has just been sort of, I mean, basically forgotten about. And except for the French, you know, in the last 5 years or so, maybe, I would say that's probably somewhere between, you know, 4 to 8 years, who developed a more, let's say, muscular pan-Europeanism to try to incorporate the Balkans. I mean, I think they realize the risk. The risk is you could have micro Yugoslavian, you know, conflicts going on for, you know, for a very long time, and they don't want that, obviously, and obviously the Chinese and Russians and others going in and sowing, you know, challenges or whatever. But you know, Europe should have, in the last 20 years, developed a real pathway for these countries into Europe, into the European Union, and whatever you call it, right? You call it some kind of tier 3 thing. I don't care what you brand it, but a way to sort of institutionally integrate these states. Because if you don't do that, I don't see how you disrupt this cycle. Because there's no other outside forces that are driving it towards sort of middle-class modernity in any other way. Does that make sense or no?
Yep.
All right. Any last questions before we close it out?
I have a lot of questions, but we'll do it another time.
I mean, if they're existential questions like why do people have identities?
No, why they fight about the name? I mean,
You know what's interesting?
Oh, okay, Marika, have you ever been to a sports stadium?
No, of course, and I know for sure. Yes.
Oh yeah,
yes.
no. So
I mean, River
And I've
Plate
been in the
versus
soccer.
Boca.
people's
I mean,
ability to fight over things that are completely meaningless is infinite.
Right, but their killing is a different.
No, I know, but
They
Marika,
kill in soccer, you know, games.
Marika,
You
I
know,
don't
they
think
kill
we-
each other.
Yeah,
They fight.
but-
Some people get killed.
but Marika,
well, Aaron's thing.
River Plate versus Boca in Argentina is
I know.
arguably the most violent confrontation in the history of sports.
Yeah.
And it's ongoing. No one can stop it. They basically try to put guardrails around it.
I'll give you a
And-
story, Aaron. You know Matt Damon, right? Matt Damon
Yeah, of course.
is Argentinian.
Yep.
So he went to Buenos Aires, and he wanted to take his kids for this rivalry, Boca Juniors versus, and they told him, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" He goes, "I'm taking my kids to the stadium." I said, "Are you crazy? You gotta go by yourself. You can't take kids to the stadium."
So exactly. So I'll give you a little story. I went down there 8 years ago, 2013. I was for work, and I tried to time it for when they play in the fall. And I went to the Boca, basically their bar. You pay basically a mafia tribute, right? You pay the equivalent of about, you know, you basically pay $80, and you get a jersey, you get drinks. Like, you're not buying security, but you're buying security. Like, they give you some chopsticks, and then that's it. And I was in that group, and it's this wave, and I was with these mafioso type guys, and they really were. I mean, these were scary dudes, and that was it. That was, I paid, and you know, and I got my ticket. It was like a full service thing, and that was it. And
You
went
pay your
back.
dues.
You pay your dues to the club. That's what it is. I literally
Yeah.
paid my dues to the club. I signed my name into a little sheet of paper, you know, like a book, and I'm a member of, you know, that Boca club, and that's why I got. But if you went to the stadium there as just another person, and you weren't on one of these sides and one of these sort of protected ecosystems, I mean, it's ridiculous. It's insane. They have It's the only place I've ever seen that has fences from the stands curving all the way over with barbed wire, so fans can't climb into the stadium environment, like into the field. So you know, I don't think the Balkans are maybe the craziest place when it comes to certain things. I
Well,
think
when it comes to the soccer clubs too, Aaron, if you ever gone to Belgrade
that's right. Red Star.
You called just like Istanbul. What
Yeah,
are they
exactly.
called?
Red Star. Yeah.
Yeah. It used to be called what? The Devil's Den or something.
Yeah, exactly. Devil's Den. Yeah, the Devil's Den. And I've gone to Galatasaray and Fibonacci, what they call hell. Like that's what they call the stadium, hell.
Yeah.
Because basically they just turn on like 10,000 flares and it looks like you're in hell. You know, and it's so I mean, this is tribalism, but we've accepted it because it's sport and it sort of has a starting point and an ending point, or we think it does. And I just think this is sort of what's going on in the Balkans is a mini manifestation, really, of some of these types of rivalries.
I was like the entire point that I wanted to introduce by bringing up sports is that even if you believe that these ethnic identities and cultural identities and senses of being are complete fabrications and completely ridiculous, people are more than willing to be violent over them.
Right.
And sports, we all agree, is completely ludicrous and a complete fabrication, right? There's absolutely no reason why anybody should really care that insert sports phenomenon here is able to kick a ball through a goalpost or hit a ball with a wooden bat. Like there's no reason why that should lead anybody to violence or
the rules are universals.
Right, but it's not that. It's that there's no real, like, I'm trying to find
We should give more soccer balls to the Balkans. I mean, that's a
no. The point that I'm making is that the fact that Derek Jeter, for example, let's say he hits the ball, what is it?
Right.
His batting average was like 300 or something, whatever.
Yep.
But the fact that he can hit the ball more effectively than anybody else should not be a reason that somebody should violently attack another person. Like there's no reason why that correlation should exist, and yet it does, because people get inflamed by things, even if those things have no meaning. I would go even further to say that when it comes to these national identities, because they're grafted onto religion, and because they're grafted onto personal historical grievances, and because they're grafted onto senses of livelihood changing, and because they're grafted onto things that actually do have concrete meaning in a person's life, that there's so much more reason for them to go to fight for them.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that you have, roughly 40-50 million people who are living. I mean, you can almost argue, like when people would argue in 2016 and sort of rural America, kind of the forgotten America, voted mostly overwhelming, but not quite as overwhelming as you think, but let's say reasonably overwhelming for Trump and for kind of a revanchist reactionary politics. There's a version of that going on in the Balkans, which is the rest of Europe is planning on this new 21st century life. And the Balkans are sort of like this weird rural space of these forgotten people, even though they are in Europe, right? I mean, there's European countries completely surrounding them. There's literally, I mean, Europeans are cutting deals with non-European countries, 5 or 10 times more than they are with their institutions than they are with Balkan countries. And there's just this sort of like shoulder shrug of like whatever. And they, and the truth is, and this is really kind of the heart of what drove me into this topic for really years, is this sort of complete combination of sort of hypocrisy at a European wide level, and almost really a sadness that that this idea of sort of a modern person, right, and the ideal that Europe says it wants to stand for, and it kind of does, and as long as it fits what it says it is, that in their own family, right, there are these stepkids, that they literally have living in, a barn. And I'm using obviously kind of, wild language here, but at a practical level, that's really what it is. And these people know this, right? The people in the Balkans understand this, right?
They have televisions.
Yeah, they have television, they have the internet, they read, they speak. In some ways they're more sophisticated than many other people because of the complexity of where they live, where they have to work. They've worked all over the EU, and there's no one, I'd say, except for the French, basically, at this point. I think the French are the only ones, and who knows if it's the French, it might just be Macron, right? We'll find out in another year or two. But that seems to even care. I did a word search, because you can do custom word searches on Google for EU and kind of Balkans and all the names. And Poland came up, I think it was 60 times more than all of these Balkan countries combined, and the Balkans itself in EU kind of, communications and discussions and agendas and stuff. And that just doesn't square with kind of their meaning and their history. And, and this is an amazing, rich place that has incredible resources, incredible people, incredible potential in the future. And it's not going anywhere. And so, that's going to be really the test of time. So when the Chinese come in and finance these, modern bridges that change the ecology and the topography, the people there are going to say, well, who's helping? And if the states that are helping them are the Chinese, the Russians, and the United States, well, then that's where they're going to. And I would argue that is the likelihood is a new kind of micro fake Cold War is going to really kind of be the next, almost like the non-aligned countries during the Cold War. These states are going to be sort of almost not bought off, but influenced by these large powers until basically Europe wakes up one day and makes a decision to say, we're going to spend, whatever, hundreds of billions and, commit to sort of bringing the Balkans into Europe.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right.
All right, guys.
Okay.
So if you guys,
Wait. It looked like Marika had one last question.
No, don't worry.
I want to take a head count, and then if you guys can let me know about the 29th. Richard is conducting the museum tour of the Middle Eastern section. We're going to Lebanese food after that. So let me know.
I'll be there.
Okay.
I'll be there.
So now altogether, I think I've counted about, with Aaron, 7 people.
I'll try to be there.
The 29th is what, the restaurant.
Yeah.
We're gonna go to the Museum of Modern Art, right? So the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and there's that Islamic section there. So I'm just gonna point out some of the exhibits and some of the places that we've been, quote unquote, and some of the places that we're going to go, quote unquote. A lot of the stuff there is after the time period that we've already covered. So most of the stuff there is quote the future for us. Yeah, I'm going to point out what those things are, what they mean, why it looks like that, all those kinds of things. Everybody just got really excited when I showed them a picture of Muhammad. That's basically what this is.
It was interesting.
So we're meeting at the Met.
We're meeting right next to the ticketing, right? It's like right in the middle of the floor.
Okay.
No. Why don't we meet? If you go to the main entrance and you hang a left, there's a whole long Roman section, and then there's sort of like this one column that's really, really wide. It has a bottom that's like this and a top that's like this, like 2 different columns put together. When you see it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you come from the 81st Street entrance and you go straight up, that's where you are. If we all meet at that column, that way we're not congregating at the entranceway and they don't want to like hurt us or whatever. Right. Because they're like, you're standing in the way of everybody.
So it's at the entrance of the Greek galleries. I mean, the column in the Greek galleries.
Yeah.
Greek and Roman.
It's a massive column. It's like, it's a diameter of about 1 meter.
And there
Okay,
are a
so-
lot of things to see around there, so we
Alright.
can wait.
Eight-
Okay,
Thank you, Richard. Very
Yeah.
good.
thank you,
presentation.
Ricardo.
Thank you so much and
Thank
have a
you.
nice day, guys. All right.
Bye.
All right, bye.
Bye.
And don't forget to come to Islamic History tomorrow night at Tuesday night at 7.
Tuesday night, yeah. Please, have a seat. Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay,
thank you.
All right, bye.
Thank you, Rich.